We are now storing each post within its own file, and you can find those in the resources post directory. So here's the post we just looked at. But actually, it looks like we have a leftover anchor tag there. Let's get rid of those. We don't need that. All right, back to Firefox, Command R, and there we go. Now, before we move on to the next step, I want to go back to my routes/web file and have a look here. This definitely gets the job done, but it's pretty ugly. In situations like this, what I often do is I will, in a temporary comment, write what I'm trying to do. And in this case, I'm trying to, let's see, find a post by its slug and pass it to a view called post. That's what I'm trying to do here. And then this is what we actually had to do. So in situations where this doesn't look anything like this, change the code until it does look like the comment. And I'll show you what that looks like. I'm going to read this again, but look for keywords. First, view is a keyword, and then the name post is a keyword. So that part was pretty easy. Return view post. Notice the keywords and the code are included in the comment. Next, we're going to find a post and pass it to that view. All right, that's still pretty clear. Find a post and pass it to the view. Now, the only remaining step is this right here. Find a post by its slug. So what if I did something like post and then something like, well, maybe I have a post class and I find something by its slug, and that returns a post that I then pass to the view. So if we had this, would this pretty closely resemble the comment? And the answer is yes, which means why don't we try to make this work? Because at the moment, of course, it don't work. So we give it a refresh and there is no class called post. All right, sounds like we should create it. Usually you'll put things like this in your app directory or maybe your app models directory, because this is really a model for what a post is. So I will create a new class called post. And right now it's a plain old PHP object. Now, if we come back, I can import this app models post, and notice you'll see that right at the top. Okay, let's see what happens now in the browser. I think it's still going to fail. Now we're trying to call a method find, and that doesn't exist. All right, let's go on back to post, and we want a static method called find that accepts a slug. One more time, refresh, and we're not getting any errors, but we're also not returning anything from the method. So that would make sense. How do we find a post? Well, that's where this stuff comes into play. Let's cut that all out and tuck it away within this find method, like so. And then, let's see, we're not returning a view anymore. We're just returning the post. So something like that. And then I'll give you a little tip. Right here, we were building up the full path. And we started with the current directory, then we went up into the resources directory, into the post directory. But as it turns out, Laravel offers some helper functions. So for example, one of those helper functions is base path. That will give you the path, and I can click through or command click through. It'll give us the path to the base of the install, or basically the path to your project. There's other ones like app path. And these are all global helper functions, by the way. This will give you the path to your app directory right here. There's another one called resource path, and that gives you the path to the resources folder. So why don't we make use of this instead? Like so. I can get rid of all of that and replace it with resource path. And then from that point, we go into the post slug, and let's close that out. And yeah, that should do it. A little bit cleaner. But next, notice we're returning a redirect here. That's not really the job of this method. This method is responsible for finding a post. It's not responsible for redirecting to different pages in your application. Your controller or your routes method here, your closure, would be responsible for that. So with that in mind, what do we do? If there is no post for this slug, we could abort with a 404. We could throw an exception, and that would be fine. But as it turns out, Laravel already has a class called model not found. And this is an exception that represents we couldn't find the model you were looking for. And because we're later going to learn about Eloquent that uses this itself, I'm going to reach for this. If you couldn't find a post, throw an exception because we can't find this post model. But otherwise, get the contents of the file, cache it, and return it. Okay, so now I will come back and give it a refresh. We get the same thing as we had before, but now we've tucked away some of this more nitty-gritty code. Our routes file is that much cleaner. And in fact, I can remove the comment, I can inline the post, and notice how much better that looks. And as a bonus, now anywhere in our application, I can find a post by its slug. For example, if I go to the home page, I could return post, find, and I know one is my first post. So let's see what happens if we go to the home page, and there we go. We found the post. And that's much better than all of that caching code and the file get contents code. We don't need to see that every time we find a post. But now, let's go back to the home page, give it a refresh. We see all these posts here, but we're hard coding those still. If I switch here, notice all of the articles I've manually pasted in there. Okay, it sounds like if we're going to make this dynamic, I can get rid of most of these. Now I just have a single article. And what we could do is iterate over or loop over a series of articles. And we'll use standard PHP here, but later I'll show you how to use the Blade templating engine that makes things like this a little nicer to write. For each post as post, and then in for each. Okay, now, at least for the time being, we could spit out the contents of the post within an article tag. Okay, so this is ultimately what we want. But of course, if I come back and refresh, it's going to squawk because we didn't pass a post variable to the view. And fair enough. So we come back to our routes file. And now I know we need to give it some posts, but how do I get those posts? Well, this is a little tricky, right? Normally with the database, and I'm going to show you the database option in the next episode, and it's much easier. But in this case, it sounds like we need to read this directory, grab all of the files, and then get the contents of each of the files. So if I want to fetch the posts, well, once again, I could reach for a file class, I could read the directory, I could use caching, but why don't we follow a similar approach to what we had here? For example, maybe we have this post class. Can I just say, well, give me all of the posts within this folder? Can we do that? And if so, I could inline this as well, and that ends up looking fairly clean too. But right now, it's not going to work. There is no method called all. All right, we have our next step. So into my post class, I'm going to add a new static method called all, and I now get to teach you about Laravel's file facade. So if you're working along, make sure you import this one here that says facades. This is called a file facade, and think of it, it's a little hard to break down. Think of it as a class that gives you static access to all sorts of functionality. And we'll talk about this more once we're a bit more comfortable with Laravel. But notice anything you might want to do with a file is available here. The one we want is called files. This allows me to, as you see there, read a directory of files. So in our case, it's going to be the same thing. So I will copy that and paste it in. Okay, back to Firefox, refresh. And now you can see, well, those objects get stringified, but you do see the path to each of the files in that directory. Okay, let's do this. Let's go back to my routes file. And to start, well, before we inline this, I'm going to undo what I did earlier. I'm going to die and dump and debug that post variable and refresh. Now you'll see we have an array of 3 items because we have 3 posts. Each of those items is an SPL file info object. And notice, again, it has information about the file, pretty clear. What is the path to the file? What are the contents of the file? When was the file last modified? When was it last accessed? Is it writable? What are the permissions? All of that stuff is available. So have a look at this. I could say, well, give me the first file there. All right, there it is. We can get the path. So I could say, get path name, refresh, and there it is. Or as it turns out, this object, if you try to use it like a string, like this, that's effectively going to get the path name as well. So notice if I refresh, I get the same thing. Okay, but otherwise, if I want the contents, I could say get, and notice this method, contents. Give me the contents of the file. And there you go, my first post, my second post, my third post. Okay, so this is an option. Ideally though, when I die and dump the posts, I don't want these file info objects. I want the contents of each file. So it sounds like we need to return to the all method and say, well, here's our files. And then why don't we array map over them? Now, array map is sort of like a loop, but it's going to return a new array. I'll show you. If we loop over each of the files, this second argument is the thing you are looping over. Each item is passed to this callback, and then whatever I return here will be the value for that item in the array. So for example, if I just return foo and I come back and refresh, now I have an array where each item says foo. This means I could do something like this. Return file, get contents. And now if I come back and refresh, we have an array where each item is the contents of a post. Okay, not great. I'm already seeing some hurdles coming up, but it's an option. So back to PHP Storm. If you wish, you can also convert this to an arrow function, and you get something like that. And in fact, later, when you learn about Laravel collections, you could even clean this up and make it a little more fluent, but I don't think we're quite there yet. All right, back to my routes web file. We now fetch the posts. I can inline this once again. Notice how easy PHP Storm makes things like that. And let's cross our fingers and check how it turns out. Refresh, and there we go. We see all of our posts. So things are dynamic now, that's true. And in fact, if I create a brand new one, my fourth post, and update this, it'll show up. But we're starting to see some issues here. So first, my fourth post is the newest one, yet it showed up second. Seemingly the order is random. Now, one option we could do is sort these according to, as we saw earlier, the last time the file was modified. So if I most recently modified this one, then that would be sorted so that it shows up at the top. But it would also be nice if there was some way to add metadata to each of these. For example, what if I could do something like this at the top, like a little information where I could say the publish date should be about May 21st. And if you think about it, if I added meta information to all of these posts, I'd end up with so much more control. I could then even do things like this, where I say, well, I'm going to separate the title from the body itself. And that would solve a problem we're currently having. Notice in Firefox, I can see all those posts, but now because I removed the link, how do I get there? I'd have to manually do it, and that's not ideal. But if instead we added a title here, we would be able to structure our HTML differently. We could separate the body of the post from the title, from the publish date. I could even do things like this, where I could provide an excerpt. We talked about this a couple episodes ago, didn't we? Sometimes the excerpt is different from the blog post itself. So maybe the excerpt is only this section, and let's make it short. Again, notice how the post itself is separate from the metadata. Now, if allowing for this seems a little too tough right now, it's actually not. We can do it in a few minutes, and we'll tackle that in the next episode.